I want to begin this episode with a parable that inspired the idea of the labyrinth as a model for understanding anxiety. There once was a king whose kingdom was surrounded by majestic mountains and lush forests. He was known for his power and his bravery, yet despite his many material achievements and outward displays of strength, he harbored a secret fear that gnawed at his heart. The king was haunted by the worry that one day all he had built would crumble, that his enemies would finally conquer him, and that he would lose everything and everyone he held dear. Well, one night the king had a dream in which an ancient sage appeared before him. The sage exuded peacefulness. His face was radiant with compassion as he addressed the king in the dream. "O king, I've come before you because I know your secret. I know your innermost fear," and then instructed the king, "If you want to be free from it, you must find the labyrinth hidden within the forest. By navigating it, you will encounter your darkest shadows and deepest fears, but only by walking its paths and facing them can you arrive at true equanimity." Then the sage warned, "But if you refuse, your fears will devour you." When the king awoke, the dream was still so vivid and clear in his mind that he accepted it as a divine message. He took it to be true. So the next day, the king set out alone into the forest, following the sage's directions in order to find the labyrinth. After many days of travel and exploration, he was amazed to finally discover the entrance to the labyrinth, a dark and twisted maze surrounded by high walls that seemed to stretch up into the heavens. With trepidation, he stepped inside and then immediately realized the prophetic nature of his dream as he began to encounter frightening visions. First, he faced an enormous dragon whose breath of fire threatened to scorch him. But instead of fleeing, the king stood his ground and expected to be burned alive. However, the dragon's flames receded and the beast itself turned into a harmless lizard before retreating altogether. Further on into the labyrinth, the king arrived at the edge of a bottomless chasm. The fear of falling into it tied his stomach up in knots, and he hesitated. But then he remembered the words of the sage, and he took a mindful breath and took a step forward, a leap of faith, seemingly into the abyss. To his astonishment, the chasm vanished, revealing a solid path beneath his feet. And like this, the king journeyed onward and inward, facing more and more fears of loss, of loneliness, and of death. Although each confrontation was more intense than the last, he surrendered and embraced every one. And each time the fear somehow dissolved and enhanced him like salt into a broth. Finally, at the center of this labyrinth, the king found himself standing before a mirror. In its reflection, he saw not a mighty ruler as he had always projected himself onto others, but a vulnerable man, an image of himself, stripped of his crown, his riches, his subjects, and his power. This was the fear that had haunted him all along, the fear of his own insignificance. Then the king wept before his raw reflection. His tears baptized him, and he realized that everything he faced in the labyrinth were manifestations of this one deepest fear, that of the unknown, or rather losing the known, losing the identity he had constructed and clung to in denial of truth. But he could no longer keep this up. He couldn't uphold it as it was too heavy, and so he let it go. As the tears fell, the mirror cracked and shattered, revealing a simple door behind it. So the man opened the door and stepped out into the daylight, as if experiencing the sunlight for the first time. The warmth felt new on his skin, and the air tasted fresh. He found himself out of the woods with the labyrinth behind him, but also inside him. And now he felt different, with his heart and fist finally unclenched. This sense of separateness and hostility had evaporated as his circulation with the totality of nature revitalized. From that day forward, the king served, not ruled, served with humility and kindness. So the labyrinth didn't make him fierce but wise, and it became a symbol throughout the kingdom, not of terror but of the true courage of wholeheartedness, as the word implies. To walk this labyrinth, every person must navigate their own life to reach the center of their own being. And we too can metaphorically walk through this labyrinth of our own fears to our core and back. It's a path of investigation and deconstruction of the barriers to spiritual insight. Now, this labyrinth has 5 parts that we can acknowledge, and they represent different levels of fear and understanding on a mind, body, spirit level. One level is just in the body, and then we have the mind and the body together, and then just the mind, and then the mind and its notions of the spirit or soul, and then just the spirit. Now hold on, before jumping to conclusions about the implications of words like spirit, let's just take this step by step. The first part of the labyrinth, the body, instinctual fear. Now, at its most basic level, fear is barely even an emotion, but more of a reflex embedded in our biology, a code, sort of like hunger or fatigue. It's the body's natural reaction to perceived danger in the environment. It activates the fight-flight response, which involves a cascade of hormones like adrenaline, which prepare the system for defense. This type of fear is simply essential, and extinguishing this reflex altogether would not be some demonstration of spiritual maturity, but more so evidence of dysfunction or even disease, like a lesion in the amygdala, which regulates fear. Although the opposite, an enlarged amygdala, which is called hypertrophy, can happen after trauma and is equally problematic, as it generates hypervigilance and overestimation of threats in the environment. But life would not make much sense if organisms were indifferent to threats, as fear is also responsible for the forward motion of conscious existence on this planet. Here's a powerful example of that and how fear is a necessary part of the intelligence, the so-called competition and selection of nature and evolution. Mice have evolved to fear cat urine. Even though the substance itself is not harmful, it makes sense that it triggers a fearful reaction because it represents imminent danger and the proximity of a predator. However, Toxoplasma gondii is a parasite that can infect mice, which results in a fatal attraction phenomenon. The parasite dismantles the mouse's fear reflex to cat piss. In fact, they develop an odd affinity to it and are subsequently drawn to areas where cats would be lurking, which ultimately increases the odds of them being eaten. And when that happens, it then assists the parasite in making its way to its preferred host and the intestines of the cat, where it can finally procreate and complete its life cycle. So that's level 1, in the body. Level 2 of this labyrinth is anticipatory fear, or worry and anxiety between the mind and body. So it involves both now. This is the fear that begins to take on a psychological dimension as the mind can project into the future, imagining danger and dangerous scenarios that have not yet occurred but could to the body. So this kind of fear goes beyond just the body reacting with its instinct, with its reflex to a present threat, but there are countless more things that could realistically go wrong than right in the future, especially considering we have to age, we are going to get sick and we're going to die. So this level of fear can really exceed normal motivation or preparation when it runs off the rails and instead overwhelm a person with self-doubt and avoidance. That's level 2. Now, as we proceed deeper into our labyrinth of fears, we come to psychological fear, insecurity, and shame, where it's in the mind and not even concerned about protecting the body anymore. This is the fear that attacks selfhood, eroding one's sense of worth and belonging. Of course, it's likely precipitated by earlier trauma, including violence or abuse, which is then internalized as the belief that one is fundamentally flawed or unworthy or somehow permanently inadequate. Unlike instinctual fear, which is rooted in the body, or anticipatory fear, which is concerned about the future risk, this psychological fear is often anchored to the past and those formative experiences such as neglect, rejection, failure, mistreatment, or betrayal. But the tragedy in this type of fear, especially when it's weaponized by systems of oppression and its agents, is that it no longer protects or prepares the individual for survival or success, as the fear convinces the individual that they are already defeated. In his book, The Joyous Science, Nietzsche posed 3 questions about shame and then answered them. First one was, whom do you call bad? Those who always want to shame others. What is the most humane? To spare others shame. And what is the seal of liberation? To no longer be ashamed of oneself. So why is this important? Why does this matter? Because shame, like I said before, is a weapon that can prevent you from becoming who you really are and inhibit the full, creative, exuberant, glorious expression of oneself. And so shame as a religious or political or cultural force doesn't just develop within one lifetime. And we're beginning to understand the significance of epigenetic trauma and therefore how anxiety can be inherited. At Emory University, researchers conducted experiments which involved conditioning male mice to associate a particular odor, acetophenone, which smells like cherries or almonds, with an electric shock. Over time, the mice fear this odor alone, even without the shock being administered. Now, the wild and awful side outcome of this study was that the researchers also observed the presence of the fear response in the next generation of mice, even though those offspring were never exposed to the electric shock. So this inherited trait, how did it happen? Well, it was linked to changes in the sperm of the conditioned male mice. Specifically, there were epigenetic modifications, changes in gene expression without altering the DNA sequence itself, that affected the genes responsible for detecting that specific odor. So if you ever felt like you get anxiety for no apparent reason, or if you feel in your bones like you've inherited the trauma of your ancestors, now it can be explained how that's possible, how that can be true, especially considering the long-term impact of atrocities at the scale of societies. Now let's go into the 4th level. This is between the mind and the spirit, or spiritual fear. Existential dread. Between the mind and its notions of a soul. This is the fear of the unknown, but also the fear of meaninglessness or nothingness after death. This is what the mystics have called the dark night of the soul, where the seeker confronts it fully, where all previous certainties crumble, leaving one face to face with the void. Yet, this fear is also a gateway to transcendence. I had an existential crisis around 16 years old. I was grieving that some of the most important people to me had already died, and that everyone was going to die, including me. And I had a series of panic attacks about it that lasted for weeks, which were especially awkward considering how taboo death is and how everyone carries on as if that's not ever going to happen to them. And we see people living as if they're going to live forever. But it sparked my spiritual search and brought out an openness and a willingness to approach some of the wisest teachers of my life from traditions and backgrounds very different than my own. Anyways, when any of these fears in the mind become pathological, as in phobias, or collectively as cataclysmic in like war and ecocide, well, it gives rise to some intriguing paradoxes. For example, the security paradox. Individuals might build literal or metaphorical fortresses around themselves with their wealth or with isolation. However, this obsession with security often leads to disconnection from humanity and empathy. So the walls that we build to keep danger out also keeps life trapped within, making one a prisoner of their own fear, like a bird in a gilded cage. Similarly, a person with a rare phobia called barophobia, they have an irrational fear of gravity and might retreat to their bed or refuse to leave the home or engage in activities for fear of being crushed by gravity or of a heavy object being pulled on top of them. Now, the avoidance of gravity paradoxically leads to a life crushed by their own psychological constraints, or the perfectionism paradox. Someone with this type of social anxiety might avoid taking risks or starting new projects unless they are certain of success. However, this fear of failure in disguise often results in missed opportunities and unfulfilled potential or creativity suffocated by the very standards meant to ensure success. Now, finally, at the center of this labyrinth, we come to just the spirit. Now, this must mean transcendence. So level 5 is transcendence, because if we go beyond the mind and are only in this spirit realm, then it's also got to be beyond fear or fearlessness, those pairs of opposites, because all of that is in the mind down to the body. Because fear ultimately requires a sense of duality or multiplicity, me and the world of others, to contend with or to survive and to overcome, to navigate the risk when there's multiplicity. But there's no fear in deep sleep, right? Or in deep meditation when there's no mind and no others. So if there truly is a state of oneness or unity consciousness, well, then fear or courage would lose their functions and no longer be applicable. But this message is not about somehow magically jumping into this state, because there are always glimpses of it. Pay attention and you'll see when you're immersed in nature or immersed in pure love. You'll see it, you'll feel it. So instead, let's just steadily walk this labyrinth into the heart of all fears with grace and self-compassion, and help each other recognize how fear is socially constructed, and then appreciate the journey on your healing journey, because this process is not one of forced elimination of fear. Now we understand why it's there, that it's not the stupidity of our body when it gives us anxiety and tension and stress, but it's the wisdom of our body, and we can respond to it with compassion. And by breathing and standing our ground in the sense of not avoiding all of our triggers, we can recalibrate our reactions to those triggers so that we can reclaim our personal power. So again, this is not about forced elimination of fear, but of its gradual transformation. I'll conclude here with a poem from Lebanese author and mystic that sums this all up. That is Khalil Gibran. And this poem goes like this. It's said that before entering the sea, a river trembles with fear. She looks back at the path she has traveled. From the peaks of the mountains, the long winding road, crossing forests and villages. And in front of her, she sees an ocean so vast that to enter there seems nothing more than to disappear forever. But there's no other way. The river cannot go back, and nobody can go back. To go back is impossible in existence. The river needs to take the risk of entering the ocean, because only then will fear dissolve, because that's where the river will know it's not about disappearing into the ocean, but of becoming the ocean. Thank you.